Hi guys, it's me, Pretzl Cosplay, and welcome to another tutorial video. In today's video, I want to show you how I made this Lady Dimitrescu cosplay. So if you want to know how I made this costume, then keep watching this video. I made the pattern for the dress myself, but if you're not good at making patterns, I definitely recommend to check out the sewing pattern, crafting pattern and tutorial PDF that you can find on my website. I will link it. To make this dress, I actually upcycled an old tablecloth, but if you don't have an old tablecloth, I recommend to buy about 5 or 6 meters of stretchy white fabric. I draw all the pattern pieces onto my fabric and add quite a bit of seam allowance because I still needed to check if the pattern would fit me, so then I would have some wiggle room. I cut out all the pieces with some fabric scissors and then I used some pins to pin the panels of the dress together. Because I still didn't know yet if the pattern would really fit me, I first did some basting stitches, so that means I stitched very roughly by hand with needle and thread to just put the dress together. This way I could try the dress on and see if I would have to make any adjustments to the pattern, like for example taking it in or making it wider. I could now also see how I would need to do the ruffles on the front. So I just took some pins and put it in place. Then also try on the sleeves to see if I made them the right shape and size. And as you can see, it's too wide. So I needed to make some adjustments on the sleeves, which I did by adding some pins into it and then trying it on again, and that should be better. The adjustments that I made on the dress I now transferred onto my pattern. So here you see I made the sleeve a little bit more narrow and then I transferred that onto my fabric. Of course now I would need to do some baste stitching again, so I could try the sleeve on and see how it fits. So there I go again with some hand stitching, really rough, large stitches. Doesn't need to be neat, it just needs to be held together for now. And this way of adjusting the pattern can also be used for store-bought patterns, not only for the patterns that you make yourself. And look, now it fits really well. So that was quite easy to do. Now the whole dress is still sewn together, so I take a seam ripper and rip all the seams, so I end up with all of the pieces of fabric that are loose again. And then I can start putting the actual dress together with my sewing machine. Oh yeah, now it's time to start the actual sewing! Woohoo! Here you see the front lining, and I made it out of 2 pieces because I had to work with my tablecloth, but you can also make it out of 1 piece. Now I just sewed them together by using a zigzag stitch on my sewing machine and the walking foot to make the fabrics not slide. The walking foot is actually really helpful for sewing stretchy fabrics like this lycra. And now the 2 pieces are sewn together. It's not the most pretty solution, but that was all the fabric that I had, and the seam is still stretchy, so it works. This is the lining for the back of the dress, and it consists of 2 pieces, and I just pin it on the middle back seam, and then I can sew it with my serger, which is a really awesome machine for sewing items that need to remain flexible but still need strong seams. On the front I add a little bit of fabric to make it thicker, and then we can continue on the front panel. I made the front panel out of 2 halves because, again, my fabric wasn't bigger. And then I pinned the middle seam together and also 2 darts on the sides. These darts are really important to make the ruffles in the end lay nice and pretty. So don't forget to sew these darts. Next to my serger, I also use my sewing machine, which is great. It's a Bernina and I love it a lot. So for the darts, I just take a straight stitch and I stitch right on the line that I drew Of course, always I take the pins out before I sew the fabric, because if you sew over the pins, you can damage the sewing machine. And that's definitely something you don't want, because sewing machines can last your whole life, and treat it right. So this is how the finished dart looks like, and as you can see, it will help with making the pleats sit nicely. Now I can lay the front panel on top of the front lining and check that it's aligned. The dart should be at the waistline. Then I just check a little bit how the pleats would look by just pleating it a little bit loosely. And then when I'm happy with the pleats, I pin them down, only on the front panel, not all the way through the lining. And I mark the middle of the lining so I can keep it in place. And then I also put the pins, of course, in the other half. The whole top needs to be pleated. The pleats can be a little bit tricky to sew down because the fabric, because it's very slippery, it just wants to unfold. So you can help that a little bit by pressing on the pleats with a pin while you're sewing it. Again, never sew over or through the pins. And the top of the front panel now looks like this, nice and pleated. And we also need a little strip of fabric to fold over the top, so it will have a nice finish for the neckline. And I already pinned this down and sew this so that this will stay in place. And because we want this seam to stay flexible, but we still want to use a straight seam, I'm holding both sides of the piece and stretch it out a little bit while I'm sewing. But I stretch it on both sides, so that means I'm not pulling on the fabric so it pulls on the needle, because that can damage the needle and the machine. Okay, let's try on the front and see how it looks with the pleats. Very nice. And now there comes a little bit messy part. I think it could be done better, but this is how I fixed it. So I folded over the neckline on the lining, and then I sewed that down around the neckline, and then I pinned the front on the neckline, and of course I also trimmed the darts because I forgot that earlier, and I also pinned it on the sides. And apparently I forgot to film the next step, which was sewing those seams down. Let's work on the back panel now. These are the two middle back panels, and I pinned them together in the middle back, as you can see. And also the side back panels I pinned to it, so this is the full back panel. With my serger I then sewed all those panels together, so I had a really nice finishing of the seams, and they would remain stretchy, which is perfect for this stretchy dress. Which also brings me to the point that it's important to use the right settings for your serger when sewing stretchy fabrics like this. So you need to set the dual transport to a wide setting so you don't get wrinkles, and you also need to use some stretch needles in the machine. And there you can see that the seams are very neat and stretchy. The next step is to make the back flap. Lady Dimitrescu has some kind of flap on the back of the dress, and I'm making it out of 3 pieces of fabric that are connected like this. First, I will sew one piece together, well, 2 pieces obviously, but I'm sewing one seam. Then I will sew the other piece to both of those pieces. To finish the bottom of the back flap neatly, I fold it over and then pin it so I can stitch over it and hem it, basically. Here I fold it over just once, but you can also fold it over twice. That will look a little bit neater. And then with a straight stitch on my sewing machine, I stitch over the hem of the back flap, and then the back flap is finished. And here is the little ruffle, that's a signature thing for Lady Dimitrescu. And that's how it looks on the inside. Now I can take the lining for the back and then put the back panel outer layer on top of it, and of course also the weird flap thing. And as you can see, I will sew it on the edges, so these 3 layers will be connected. Again, with a straight stitch on the sewing machine. This is just to hold the pieces together. And also, I made the lining short, so just above the knees, but again, I didn't have so much fabric, though you can make the lining longer if you want. Here you can see it, the lining is shorter than the dress. And now, let's add some pockets! We need 2 pieces of pocket for each pocket. Yes, that's how pocket works. And then I pin the pocket piece to each side of the dress, on the front, as you can see here, but also on the back. So that is 4 pieces of pockets. Then, with a straight stitch on the sewing machine, I stitch the pockets to the both front and back panel of the dress, but separately. I also sew a little bit further, just so it's really well connected. Make the dress without pockets, then just skip this step. The silhouette will look a little bit better, but of course pockets are super handy and practical, so I choose to make them. Then I can put the front on top of the back and sew all along the sides with the pockets. Of course, I put the front and the back of the dress with the right sides of the fabric together. And then, with a straight stitch on the sewing machine, I first sew around the pocket and a little bit above and below it. Technically also do this with the serger, but then I can't make very straight corners, which are actually useful where the pocket starts. It's a little bit difficult to explain, but just do it like this and it will be the easiest, I promise you. So sew with the sewing machine a little bit above, over the pocket and a little bit under the pocket. And then, look, the pocket is functioning. Here you can see that it's sewn with a straight stitch on the sewing machine and there is the straight corner. I still need to connect all the other pieces. And that's of course the shoulder seams and also the sides that I didn't sew yet. And for this I'm using the serger because this gives the best seam for stretchy fabrics, and it also finishes the edges really nicely. So those were the shoulder seams, and now I still need to sew the front and the back panel together along the sides, but not all the way over the pockets. I will stop a little bit before the pockets. If you don't have a serger, you can also make this whole dress with the sewing machine, but then I advise to use a zigzag stitch instead of the straight stitch for everything, because that stitch will keep the seams stretchy and flexible. Because I know a serger can be an extra expense and it's not very cheap, so of course you can make the whole dress with a sewing machine. It's definitely possible, so no worries. Now the front and back panel are fully sewn together and only the sleeves are missing. And here on the side you see that there's still a little bit of thread left from the serger, but we can fix that easily. I just take a blunt needle, a thick needle, and then I put that through the serger seam. And then I take the loose threads and put them through the hole of the needle. And then simply pull it through and tada, it's nicely finished. And then just do that for all the ends of the serger seams. Now it's time to start with the sleeves, because we don't want a sleeveless dress. So I pin the sleeves closed and then I sew them closed with the serger, and now the sleeves are finished. That's super easy. At the top of the sleeve, the seam will fit exactly in the armhole seam, in the side seam of the dress. So I will put it there and then pin it so it will stay in place. The top of the sleeve itself is a little bit too wide to fit in the sleeve opening, and I did that on purpose because I want some ruffles on the top to make it a little bit puffy. So to make it work, just ruffle the fabric and make it fit. It doesn't need to be neat at all, just make it fit. Put some pins in it so it will stay put while you're going to sew it. I always love to make puffy sleeves because I think they look really elegant. And once it's all pinned down, it will stay in place, and that's really helpful when we're going to sew it. I'm sewing the sleeves into the armholes again with the serger because I want a clean, neat seam that stays stretchy. And this can be a little bit tricky because of all the pins, so please remember to take out the pins before you're sewing through it, because the serger also has a knife and you don't want the pins to get stuck in the knife and ruin the knife, and it's not good for your machine. Actually, it could also be a little bit dangerous, so just take out the pins before you sew through it. If you finish watching this video, then don't forget to download the pattern from my website. It will make your life a whole lot easier. And voila, the sleeve is inserted. And now I can actually turn the whole thing inside out to reveal how the dress looks. Woohoo! It's magic! It's always an exciting moment when you can flip the whole garment inside out and see how it looks and see if you made it how you wanted it. And then, of course, we also still need to attach the pleats on the front, and I just tried on the dress and checked where I wanted the pleats to sit exactly, and then I just pinned it together so I would know where I would have to attach the pleats. Oh, and of course try out the pockets. I had marked the place where I would need to push the pleats to with some pins on the lining of the front. And then I would have to match up these pins with the end of the dart that we have sewn in the front panel. Are you still following me? And then I just pinned the front panel to the lining on those places. So at all times the shape of the front would be guaranteed. And then I still had a little strip of fabric that I would sew over this to capture the pleats, and it's also a little detail that fits to the dress of Lady Dimitrescu. So I just sewed over it to attach it, and I left the pleats actually loose inside, so this could still move a little bit when wearing the dress. And here you can see on the inside where it's sewn. Now I still needed to hem the sleeves, and to do that I folded the edge of the sleeves inside double and then sewed over it with a zigzag stitch so it would remain stretchy. For the bottom hem of the dress I did the same, so I folded the edge double to the inside and then I pinned it down. And with a zigzag stitch on my sewing machine I then stitched over it to close the hem. You could also do this with a twin needle, then you can also get really neat hems with two seams that stay stretchy. But I actually liked how the zigzag stitch looked quite decoratively on the hem of the dress and on the sleeves. To add some final details to the dress, I hand sewed some satin buttons onto the middle back and on the sleeves. And then I could try on the dress for real, because now it was finished and I like it. I think the dress turned out pretty cool and I feel awesome when wearing it. In a previous video I already showed you how I made the big enormous hat for Lady Dimitrescu with EVA foam. I will link it in the description below. But first, finish watching this video. The steps that I didn't show in that other video are these. I also did some sanding on the edges and the seams of the foam so it would be nice and smooth. And then to shape the brim of the hat, I heated up the foam with my heat gun until the foam was a little bit more shapeable. And then I just shaped the hat how I wanted it, which was a little bit tricky for such a big hat. And after shaping the hat, I let it cool down in that position. And then to finish off the top of the hat, I used some really super thin foam. It's only 1 millimeter thick, so that's super thin. And it can look a little bit like fabric when you fold it. And you can actually get this foam at Mink in the Netherlands, and they have different thicknesses of foam. The head itself is made out of 5mm thick high density EVA foam, and this extra layer is made out of the 1mm thick high density EVA foam. And I just glue it around the top of the head with some contact glue. Contact glue is a really great glue to use for foam, and you need to apply it on both pieces that you want to glue together, then wait a little bit for it to become tacky, and then press both pieces together to make a strong bond. And then the head was finished with crafting, and then I could go further with painting it. But I actually used a paint that's also a primer in one. It's Hex Flex in black to paint the head. So I just had to paint it once and it was done. This primer and paint in one is really nice to use. It is not smelly, so you can use it inside and you can just brush it on. As you can see, I brushed in the direction of the head, so I would get as little as possible visible brush strokes. I can really recommend this primer. And when it was dry, it dried actually matte, so not glossy, and it looked very cool on the head. So now let's see how I made those claws. I used a material that's called Sintra or Forex. It's actually a very rigid plastic, but you can cut it quite easily with a box cutter. So I drew a pattern for my claws and cut 5 of them out, one a little bit smaller for the thumb and the other for exactly the same size. And like this, they fit on my fingers. The Sintra that I used is 2mm thick. The edges right now were quite sharp, so I used some sanding paper to soften the edges of the Sintra. To make the claws actually fit on my fingers, I made a fake finger with some fabric and painter's tape, and then I took a little bit of white Worbla, Worbla's pearly art. I heated up the Worbla so it gets soft and sticky, and then I wrapped it around the fake finger and pressed it together, cut off the excess material, and then placed the claw inside it. The thermoplastic needs to be heated up because otherwise it doesn't stick to each other. And Sintra is basically also a thermoplastic, so it sticks to Worbla when they're both heated up. And then I just needed to get the fake finger out of the thimble, and then I could wear it on my actual fingers, like this. The claws needed to be black, so first I primed them with 2 layers of PVA primer to make it super shiny, and then I sprayed some black acrylic paint over it, and to finish it I sprayed some super glossy acrylic varnish over it. For the gloves I sewed some fingerless gloves with a sweater fabric. Of course you can also buy gloves, because sewing gloves is really difficult. Then to attach the claws to the gloves, I put it both on my hand, and then with some needle and thread I stitched the open part of the fingers a little bit tighter around the claws so it would stay in place. And no, I didn't sew through my skin because obviously there's Worbla underneath, so it was fully safe. It was a little bit tricky, to be honest, because when you're wearing gloves with such big nails, everything is tricky. I only made these claws for one hand, so I only needed to do this 5 times for 5 fingers. And then I could wear the claws with my costume, and they look super awesome. But we're still missing some things. Vampire fangs. For the fangs I'm using some Worbla's deco art, and I heat it up so it gets soft. You can also heat it up in some warm water. And then I pre-shape it a little bit so it looks like fangs. And then I mold it over my upper teeth and then use my fingers to bring it into shape. It's really tricky to do this, actually. And I also needed a few tries to get it right. But when you get it right, you have some fangs that you can easily take out of your mouth, put back in it, and it's great for photos. Just only wear them for photos and not for eating or other things, because you don't want to accidentally swallow the fangs. Please be safe. To make the necklace, or the pendant, for Lady Dimitrescu, I took some red Worbla scraps, Worbla's flame red art, and also a little piece of metal wire, and then I sculpted the shape of the pendant. I used some wooden clay modeling tools to get the shape in the Worbla, and when the Worbla is heated up, it's soft, so you can sculpt with it, and especially red Worbla is really smooth, so it's perfect for making detailed things like this. When it was finished crafting, I could prime and paint it. I primed it with some PVA primer to make the surface really smooth and prepare it for paint. The thread roll was really handy as a handle. For the shadow color for the silver, I painted the pendant with some black acrylic paint. I only needed one layer. Silver is a cool toned color, so that's why black is really great for the shadow color. Then I took some gilding wax from Pebeyo, which is a really nice material. You can use an old sock, for example, or another piece of cloth and dip it into the gilding wax and then just rub it over your project. And it will magically turn metallic. It's really, this material is just so great, I love it. And it comes in more colors, but for this I needed silver. And to finish it, I could add some glossy varnish over it, which I forgot to fill. And I added the pendant to a fake pearl necklace to finish off the look. And then my Lady Dimitrescu cosplay was done. I only still added a rose to the costume, which I just bought at a jewelry store long ago. So now you know how I made this Lady Dimitrescu cosplay. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you can use the techniques that I showed you for your own costumes. Oh, and don't forget that you can find the sewing pattern for this dress and the crafting pattern for the hat on my website. I will link them in the description below. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss my other videos. Bye bye!